Murtaza Hussain is a reporter at the Intercept who focuses on national security and foreign policy. He's appeared on CNN, BBC, MSNBC, and other news outlets. We had a sobering conversation about the political structure of the globalized world. And one of the many frank projections that Murtaza shares in the conversation is his sense that it's fairly likely that the United States and China will be engaged in some form of military conflict within the next 20 years. There's a deep analysis here that centers around a serious gap between the world that he wants and the world that he sees. And much of the conversation comes back to that gap between the moral aspirations that we might have as empathetic citizens of the world, the rights-based order we wish existed, and the inherently conflictual nature of the world as it is. He actually expands on the ways that a tradition of political philosophy engages with the extent to which nations are locked into efforts to constrain each other through force and dominance, and suggests that refusing to grasp that means we miss a lot about the structure of societies. Again, he makes it clear that the world he reports on and tries to understand is not the one that he wants to exist, but I think it's for that reason that he reports on global affairs in the honest, shrewd way that he does. I mean, in this conversation, he's talking in no uncertain terms about how Ukraine's decision to denuclearize, to not retain nuclear weapons, meant that they had to abandon the ultimate guarantor of national sovereignty. Given up under global pressure and the promise of incentives, assurances that were not met, the loss of a nuclear arsenal, he feels, in part led to the current situation that Ukraine is facing, where the international community has determined the cost of deterring Russia is too high, and the country cannot fully defend itself against Russian aggression. What does it mean that this terrifying power is an insurance policy in the contemporary world? Ignoring the reality doesn't change it. And yet, as he points out, there are realities that can and are being ignored. While there's little evidence for sanctions actually contributing to a change in the behavior of governments, sanctions are still imposed without any real consideration for the social impact or political effectiveness they will have. As Hussain says, they're done without even thinking because no one is holding you to account, and the death that they produce is indirect. So in terms of the United States positing itself as a benevolent actor by imposing sanctions or even arming Ukraine, it's unclear whether anyone in the global community actually feels that it wipes the imperialist record of the US clean, just because it currently seems to be on the right side of a military conflict. What I found so profound, too, in what Murtaza was talking about here is that he over and over comes back to this question of establishing a moral baseline in a world torn apart. He says that there is clearly a, quote, grievous disparity between what lives are considered grievable or not. And that what this means is that outside of the political and epistemological boundaries of the nation state, we need to really think seriously about what our principles are beyond these vast imperialist power blocks. The alternative is a world where there is, to again quote him, there's a collective conspiracy of silence about human rights abuses because we're all doing it.
It's such a great opportunity in some ways to be able to speak with you about the writing that you've been doing in general, but lately, in for the Intercept in relationship to the war in Ukraine and the place of the United States in this contemporary battle for global hegemony. This seems to be like a special research interest almost that is coming through in your work. And on that point, I read an interview recently in Jacobin with Walden Bello, the Filipino scholar and activist. And in this interview, he says that the war is being used by the U.S. to regain its primacy as the global hegemon. Especially, he says, after the hit to the United States' reputation after its defeat and withdrawal from Afghanistan, which he says was also a NATO defeat. And so this is just, to me, not a main part of the sort of media narrative at all. The idea that at this kind of higher level, at this almost meta level of geopolitics, there's a kind of competition for global hegemony happening. So, I wanted to maybe ask you specifically about this article that you wrote recently about the crisis in Ukraine and this notion of a post-American world that is emerging. Like, you talk about how there has long been an imperious relationship between Western elites and the rest of the world. I think, people maybe understand that implicitly, maybe not enough, I don't know. But you also talk about how, like, particular countries and regions of the world are obviously being perceived by the U.S. as kind of key for the purpose of controlling China's growing power, and how, like, these kinds of struggles are emerging in the wake of Russia's incursion now into Ukraine. So I don't know if you could speak to that in general, maybe to start out. I know it's a big question, but, like, this idea that, like, there are calculations being made in the global south around who to side with or how to, maintain a position of neutrality, and how that itself is, like, calling into question the hegemony of the United States.
Yeah. First of all, well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for
sure. Yeah.
The interest in the subject. So I would say that, it's interesting. Like, in the 20th century, there were, major blocks of powers aligned with either Soviet Union or the U.S. and Europe, as the anchors that the U.S. Throughout the Cold War. And during that time, very early, it was determined that after World War II ended, and it's clear that the Soviet Union and the U.S. were going to be at odds with each other for a significant amount of time, a lot of countries around the world immediately calculated that this would not be in their interest to be aligned with either of these powers, which were both quite imperious in their own ways. They both wanted to use other countries for proxy wars or to exploit them for resources or put them under various forms of political control. And they sought ways to avoid that. And then through that, you had the emergence of what in the 20th century was called the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was a movement of countries from Asia and Africa, what we call the ASEAN world today, and Latin America to some extent as well too, who sought to band together on the basis of being neither right nor left, or rather neither U.S. or Soviet aligned in this Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very appealing and attractive position for a lot of countries. And what you've seen is that that there was, like, relative degrees of protection they were able to afford themselves. Even countries which were communist, like Yugoslavia, tried to chart a third path, but it was very difficult. And what you found is that many of these countries, nonetheless, ended up becoming parties to the rivalry between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was kind of the end of it. It seemed like, okay, there's only one alternative now, which is liberal capitalist democracy as defined by the United States. And, I think it's interesting, like, I'm in my mid-30s and my whole life has been pretty much under the post-Cold War world. It's been under a world where unipolar power and the international system is taken as a default assumption. But I think it's changing now. I think it's changing because the U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world, and it's almost certainly going to be a very, very powerful player in the world for a very, very long time. But its relative power is decreasing, and to a level which would have been unimaginable perhaps in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. And you see China is emerging as economic power. It may surpass the U.S. in the size of its total economy in the years to come. India is also another country which has huge demographic weight and is now gaining some degree of economic and political power commensurate with that. And, you have a more strategically autonomous Europe, which is seeking to assert itself. You have a lot of countries. You have the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There are a lot of rising powers around the world. And what that means is that, these powers, once they get economic power that is sufficient for them to provide for themselves or exert influence, they're going to have their own views about foreign policy. And they're not going to want to be de facto looped into whatever the U.S. wants to do at any given time. So I think what's interesting, what you see now with this Ukraine conflict is this, the U.S. has taken a very strong stance against Russia, and what seems, I think it's correct to call Russian aggression against Ukraine at this time, and Western Europe as well too. And they seem to usually portray their own opinion, like the U.S. and Western opinion, as being the international community, quote unquote. But you're not really seeing that. You're seeing that many other countries around the world are taking a far more nuanced position, not for any reasons of morality per se, but their interests are different. They're calculating their own interests, just the way the U.S. calculates its own interests in determining what foreign policy to embark upon.
Mm-hmm.
Its own path. So they weren't really able to do that in the 20th century. Countries weren't able to calculate their own interests. They had under a lot of pressure to align with either one of the two major blocks or align with a third block, which is defined by the fact that it was not one of those blocks. So now, like, India is not trying to create an alliance of third powers which have a independent view on the subject. They're just saying, well, no, we have military ties with Russia, we have trade ties with Russia, and we're not going to drop that because you're telling us to, because something bad is happening in Ukraine that is attributable to them. I saw actually an interview today with former Brazilian leader Lula da Silva, and I don't necessarily agree with what he said, but he took a line about the Ukraine conflict that is not the same line as the U.S. or EU position on it. He said that both sides were to blame for it, and he even suggested that Zelensky was more to blame for it than the Russian president. I don't agree with that, but he's a major statesman of a major Latin American country, the anchor state of Latin America, and that view is not unrepresented around the world. It's probably a prevalent view in a lot of places, and it's interesting. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm definitely saying it's a big difference from the world where it was taking the assumption that the views in DC would be normative for everyone else.
I think this is why the analysis is so invaluable. It's trying to stay with the murkiness of it in some ways, and acknowledging, as Bello does in this interview, that you can't now create a unified anti-Russian alliance. It's just not going to work. In fact, he goes one step further and says everyone knows the U.S. is really using the Ukrainian crisis to reassert its hegemony. That is to say, everyone in the developing world primarily is what he's talking about, right? Nations that, as you point out, in the 20th century were primarily not in charge of their own kind of destiny, or not able to make these kinds of autonomous calculations on their own behalf. And I think so much of your writing is about trying to expose how these calculations are often on the basis of life and death considerations around how to feed your population, how to fuel your population, these kinds of things. Like you talk about, there's a phrase, for example, in the article where you write, morality aside, there are concrete material reasons that, Indians are choosing to keep ties with Russia. And you talk about how African countries are keeping ties partly due to food supply concerns. And also secondarily, perhaps, the fact that Russia represents a, quote, alternative to the West for investment and security support. So it's really interesting for me to kind of think about the ways in which outside of this kind of unipolar, world, morality and a kind of crude materialism are running side by side. That there are questions of material survival. And then on the side, as it were, questions of morality. You talk in the article about how, it's kind of odd or ironic or ill-timed that the world is fractured in the way that it is because, as you put it, the American position on the war in Ukraine is built on a strong moral case. So are we now inhabiting in some ways like a post-moral universe where, the nature of capitalism is that there is this level of instability and we have to kind of wrap our heads around first those crude materialist kind of aspects of countries' calculations about how to position themselves politically?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not totally convinced that there was ever compelling moral argument for the previous U.S.-led order. I think that there were very strong arguments and information campaigns that existed. And sometimes they're plausible and sometimes they weren't, but I don't think that was the primary lodestar of U.S. policymaking, even at the peak of the liberal order. You could say I do think I'm not saying that it's completely immoral. I just think that it was probably exaggerated the degree to which that was a very salient calculation in U.S. foreign policy decisions.
Like freedom as morality in some sense. Yeah.
Yeah, the defense of human rights. I think it's very, very implausible. But it was a compelling narrative, and it was a compelling aspirational narrative, and I do think that they paid lip service to it. And I actually think that the lip service, I think people disagree with me about this in some cases, but I do think that lip service is sort of better than nothing, because at least you're acknowledging the legitimacy of a particular moral position, by which you could be theoretically shamed out of it, or you're setting a baseline for others' behavior too, even if your own behavior doesn't live up to it. And to a degree, I think there's a degree of hypocrisy which cannot be borne anymore. And to see a world where there's a collective conspiracy of silence about human rights abuses, and everyone agrees it's not something to talk about, and it's not something to criticize others for because we're all doing it, that would be worse. I think that would be, in a marginal but significant way, it would be worse than a hypocritical U.S.-led world order. There's a saying that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some truth to that. And this question, I think you made an interesting point about, is this crisis being used to reassert U.S. hegemony? I think that something actually quite interesting is happening, is that the reason that U.S. hegemony decreased over the last 20 years was because I think the number one reason for that is that U.S. elites were seen to be incompetent. So they kept saying that they were going to deliver X, Y, Z thing. Instead, they kept delivering disaster upon disaster. It was, we saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan. Up to last summer, we saw this in Afghanistan. The collapse of the Afghan government, just humiliating defeats again and again, and apparent lies and failures. It's complete, like a whole generation's perspective was formed based on observing this, myself included. But something interesting in the last 3 months, you saw something which you haven't seen in a long time, which is that U.S. security elites have looked pretty competent, and they've looked especially competent in comparison to Russia. They've correctly predicted events that were going to take place. Their logistical acumen has been demonstrated quite effectively. They've been made the Russians look really, really bad in many, many ways in the last 2-3 months. And I think that the number one determinant of legitimacy of any system is not how ideologically coherent or moral it is. It's the level of faith people have that the elites behind the system are competent. I'll give you another example. I know I've talked to a lot of people, Chinese citizens, about this in the past. And, I talk about the Chinese Communist Party. And these people are not communist, and they're completely ideologically agnostic, and they don't like everything the government does, but they're like, it's undeniable they've built all this infrastructure. It's undeniable that people have gotten richer. Mm-hmm. So, regardless of what they're doing something right. So that's a compelling, I think that's the default most important determinant. So I think that, U.S. hegemony is being, or U.S. influence, you could say, is being revived right now by the crisis in Ukraine. But I think it's because of their own effective response to that crisis. If they'd responded ineffectively, if the Ukrainian government had completely folded immediately the way that the Afghan government did in the face of an attack,
right,
the Russian attack, then I think that you'd be talking about how the empire is just completely over. We'd be talking about, getting the pitchforks out for U.S. elites because they clearly do not have any legitimacy or ability to govern. Not because, of any morals. That's not really aside from the point, aside from the morality of whatever happened. Just the fact that people were clearly idiots and they're getting all this money and they're just wasting it and they don't know what they're doing. We have to get them out of here. But that's not the case right now. And in Europe, you can see that effectively a lot of Europeans, they're very glad that the U.S. is there because without the U.S. backing, you'd be seeing a lot more Russian aggression well beyond Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I think that's again kind of like just an undeniable kind of empirical observation in some ways that hegemony is dependent on whether you can demonstrate a certain kind of competence, coordination. Like you've written on Twitter about the United States, again, like morality aside, being very capable in certain like logistical ways, right? Like just being able to command a supply chain and being able to coordinate these kinds of things, being able to run a state effectively and provide power and these kinds of, there's all kinds of chaos in the system at the same time, I think. In the structure of the political system in the United States, for example, we're seeing the ways in which, my God, like a leak of a draft Supreme Court decision can make a country erupt and split apart. But in these times of, geopolitical crisis, it's clear that, a certain revolution in military affairs within the United States has bred a logistical empire that makes, just the kind of blunt force approach of Russia and Ukraine look silly in some ways, right? Like the force ratio question is secondary to a certain kind of technocratic power almost. And on that point, I wanted to maybe ask you some questions about this book that you recommended that I had some kind of issues with, certainly, but that is like undeniably insightful in terms of giving us a peek into the ways that the United States kind of almost perceives itself as a military power, a country that spends more on, its defense budget than any other country by far. The book is The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict by Elbridge Colby. And, it's about, the ways in which the United States needs to adopt all kinds of strategies of really, he literally uses the term wrath, right? Like strategies of kind of imposing its military will on the world in order to prevent what Colby clearly fears is a rising Chinese hegemony. He says, he calls it Chinese hegemony and its baleful influence at a certain point. And there are all these and it seems to me like it's a book built in some ways around a fever dream, a fantasy that may come to pass, which is about, he literally imagines all of the rest of the world's power aggregated against the United States and then coercing the U.S. And, I wondered, what you gained, I guess, in some ways from reading that book, and in particular, like, as a journalist, how you incorporate research like this, into your own writing. Like you are reading this kind of scholarly literature on international politics, and, it is separate, I have to assume, from your own politics, and you keep it probably, in the margins of your writing. But like, this is a book that literally, talks bluntly about the states that matter most and ranks continents by degree of power and how advanced their economies are and so on, without any real consideration throughout the book of like morality. There's no real engagement with like justice or decolonization or climate change. Like those are not considerations for Colby. Really, he fundamentally says might is right, and so like, what did you, I guess, gain from reading that book, and how does it sort of help you understand the world, like a book like Strategy of Denial?
Yeah. So I try to read as broadly as possible. I don't think I need to per se for work. I just find that it gives you a better, deeper understanding of, it's good to read everyone's perspective and to know where everyone's coming from, and also historical context is also good. And it's interesting. It's like you're absolutely right. That book has no discussion about. It's an amoral perspective on these subjects, and it takes a certain configuration of the world for granted. And, it's a specific historical tradition of politics that goes back all the way to Thucydides, who's a famous Greek historian, and wrote a famous book called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And that book was about the war between these Greek city-states many thousand years ago, and took an assumption for granted that the world is by nature conflictual, and rising powers which are constrained by other powers, which will inevitably seek to free themselves from the constraints of those powers by force. And that's how Athens and Sparta came to conflict with one another. And there is a lot of people, U.S. elites are classicists, or people who are educated in the classics, and they pretty understandably, based on that parallel, they view the situation between Athens and Sparta as analogous to that between the U.S. and China. And in this book, as you described it, it's basically it's a do everything you can to constrain. How do we constrain China's rise? What are the options on the table? Every option, every time frame. Like, how do we do that? And what realistically are the stakes for the United States, according to this gentleman,
Mm-hmm.
if we fail to do that? And there are things in that book you mentioned, like it's like kind of glosses over. It takes things very, very simplistically in some ways for purposes of analysis. And the things I don't like, the things that I have opinions. I have like opinions about. I'm not one of the book. The book talks about creating an anti-hegemonic alliance in Asia to work together to constrain China's rise, because it is true that a lot of countries in Asia are very, very afraid of the implications of a Chinese superpower because they're right next to China, and China has passed in the last century has passed behavior at times it has power has been very bullying. So they have a lot of interest in having another power come and balance them. So, for instance, he wants to have one of the countries as the one of the anti-hegemonic powers to be India, and India is
Mm-hmm.
going through a lot of changes right now. The government is extremely far right and hostile to minorities, and all the things that China's doing in that sense, they're doing it maybe like as much or more. And but the book takes it for granted that, to set all that aside, are they powerful? Are they powerful enough that they can help us stop this other power? And if so, then that accomplishes our goal, and that's what we're looking at here. So, is that like the world that I would love to see, or want to see, or aspire to see? No, it's not. But that said, I do think that it's kind of the way the world is, in a way, arguably, not all times, but in many times. And it doesn't mean that it has to be that way, but to not engage with it, or to not understand it, I think it would result in missing a lot of what takes place in the world, or misunderstanding what's actually happening and so forth. If the U.S. were to assemble, if they had a more, actually, I will say that the U.S. actually used more arguments to make its argument against China. I think perhaps cynically to some degree. Like, for instance, the Uyghur issue is something that's been brought up a lot by U.S. elites. I don't think that they actually care about this issue that much, but I do think that it's an issue which they know has moral resonance with people. Okay, they're making human rights with China an issue. They're using it cynically because they have a rivalry with China for other reasons. But maybe there's some good in that because it might help some people, and also it sets an international baseline that human rights are something you might get shamed for if you're in the depending on your circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think this is very likely that the world will play out this way. And I think on a time frame, not that I think it's good, not that I think that it should play out this way, or think that it is not avoidable. I think it is avoidable, but I think it's very, very likely that U.S. elites and Chinese elites are going to determine that their interests are completely at odds with each other. I think that they're both rational, and there's not any realistic chance of nuclear war between the U.S. and China. But if there is not a limited war in Asia between Asian countries and against China, with the U.S. supporting in the next few decades, I'll be very surprised. I'll be very surprised.
Right.
And because they're all talking about it, they're all concerned about it, not because they hate China per se, but because it's inevitably a conflict when a new superpower emerges. It's like, I'll give you an example. When the Monroe Doctrine was fomented in Latin America, there was not really any chance for the Latin American countries to resist that. They had no chance to resist this effectively, at least. And there was no outside power which could have helped them band together or arm them as something that they could have preserved fully their territorial integrity and sovereignty against the United States empire as it emerged. These Asian countries are in a very similar situation to the countries of Latin America at that time, and they do kind of have a chance. They do kind of have a chance because they have collectively a lot of more wealth than Latin America at that time, and they have an outside force, which is the U.S. in this case, which is also on the same page and willing to arm them. So I think that is a very important to understand, and I think that alternative sources of world order or movements based, you mentioned, on climate change is also, I think, a very promising idea. I think that could also be another way that people organize themselves and according to shared interests across borders.
Yeah.
and I hope to see that emerge. But it's not the most likely thing at this point, and that doesn't gives you no pleasure to say that.
No, I hear you. And like, this is something I gained from the book. I mean, as much as the book sort of upset me, like, I think I wrote to you that it made me realize how utopian I am, like how much I just want to believe that these things don't exist. The insistence by Colby that we should not expect the contemporary environment to be different is eye-opening. Like, that's literally how he puts it. It's like, my critique would be that it does accept a certain kind of like imperial fatalism, almost like it doesn't really imagine, like it doesn't engage in good faith in a way with like the possibility of revolt, almost like global climate revolution, right? Which is something that would be a radical event that is hard to even imagine being an eventuality at this particular point. Melanie Yazzie, who I interviewed for the podcast, who's an indigenous revolutionary who works at University of New Mexico, she literally asks at the end of my conversation with her for us to imagine that the United States did not exist. Asks you to imagine the United States not existing as a way out of this kind of hurtling toward climate catastrophe. But like, that is, obviously utopian in some ways, a kind of, anti-imperialist utopia. For many people, the United States must, as Colby puts it, deter or defeat Chinese aggression. It must, right? In this kind of hegemonic play of forces, consider how to leverage Japan, for example, to embrace militarism. This is an argument Colby makes at the end of his book. It needs, like, in this kind of compulsive, fatalistic way, to embrace, as he puts it, following Russia up the nuclear ladder if necessary, like using nuclear weapons as a suitable implement of deterrence. This kind of language he uses. So there is just like a blunt realism in the book that is, it kind of strengthens your critical muscles to have to engage with that particular kind of realism. Yeah. But I guess, on that question of and I think this is, one of the more florid phrases in Colby's book, following Russia up the nuclear ladder. I wanted to ask you about the article you wrote on, itself kind of espousing a certain kind of political realism, in which you argue basically, small countries that retain a nuclear deterrent are protecting themselves. Like, we have to, just engage with the fact that, as the title of the article puts it, breaking promises to small countries means they'll never give up their nukes. Could you kind of maybe just, break down what that article is saying in terms of, why certain countries might consider it to be a smart calculation to do this thing that most people would say is absolutely absurd? Like, W.E.B. Du Bois said, like, the cause of war is preparation for war. The cause of nuclear war will be the preparation for following other countries up the nuclear ladder. But how is that now in some ways inescapable in the current moment?
So, the article, it takes Ukraine as an example. And at the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet nuclear weapons had been stationed in Ukraine. And when the Soviet Union unraveled, they were still there. And the silos were there, and the warheads were there, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So the newly independent Ukrainian government had a choice, and the choice was effectively that they could keep these weapons, and doing that would require significant amount of investment in maintenance upkeep, even if they scaled down the size of the arsenal. The arsenal, I think, was the fourth biggest in the world at the time that they became independent, maybe third biggest. It was quite substantial, and they decided they considered it. They definitely considered keeping the nuclear weapons because Ukraine, if you look historically, has been threatened by Russia a lot. They have a very unhappy history with Russia, the 20th century, the Soviet Union, very, very terrible, well-documented crimes in Ukraine. And so they're very jealously guarded about their independence for fear of something like that happening again. And they had to make a choice because nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantor of independence one way or another. They've shown them to be themselves in the last 70 years or so. Not a very pleasant guarantor, but certainly they guaranteed it. So they had a choice. They said that, we can keep these or we could give them up. And there was a lot of pressure and a lot of incentive as well to give them up from Western countries as well as Russia. They said, look, give them up. We'll sign all these treaties. We'll guarantee that no one will ever attack you again. We'll protect your sovereignty. We just want you to not proliferate nuclear weapons and to get rid of them, put them under, transfer them out of the country effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And they did that. And lo and behold, the other countries did not live up to the side of the bargain. I think maybe they would like to in the ideal world, but the cost is just too high to confront Russia in 2014. And it's too high to confront Russia directly today. The U.S. and no other countries going to war directly on Ukraine's behalf in Russia. And good that they're not doing that. It'd be a horrible risk, but they're not doing it, and that's not very good for Ukrainians. So, effectively, they kind of got burned. And there is, I'll tell you an example. In Pakistan is a poor country. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It has nuclear weapons for several decades now.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of determined that the country's elites determined that, look, we have a mortal threat, an enemy which is a completely mortal enemy, which is India, and this country may not survive very long. People are more sympathetic to India. We don't really have a lot of allies. We're much smaller than they are. And, they're developing nuclear weapons. Or even if they didn't develop nuclear weapons, it would still be the same calculation, but similar calculation. But they said, well, look, are we going to survive or are we going to die? That was kind of what they said. And there's a famous quote by the prime minister at that time. He said that, if we have to eat grass to get nuclear weapons, we'll eat grass. And they kind of did that to suffer a lot of sanctions and other things in order to get this thing, which nonetheless has protected the Pakistani state from collapsing or being further dismembered. They actually lost half their territory a few years before they made this decision in Bangladesh. But, it's an insurance policy against attack. Is it good that there's a world where nuclear weapons exist? I don't really think so. I think it's a terrible thing. It's terrifying. The idea that, a deliberate or accidental launch of nuclear weapons could kill millions of people, could theoretically end human civilization very, very quickly. There were some near misses during the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia, and it's not out of the question that something like that could happen again, either between the U.S. and another country or other countries amongst themselves. And to a degree, the amount of proliferation increases the amount of risk of accidental exchange. But if you're a small country, no one's going to defend you. And that's the reality of it. No one's defending small countries in the world that exists today if they're attacked by a big country. What's the only way of deterring a big country from attacking you? There's only one way. There's one way. If you make them so afraid that attacking you would set off a chain of consequences, they'll destroy all their cities and take away everything they want. They're going to be a lot more careful. And again, it's one of those things which is it's realistic. It's a grim reality. It's an unfortunate reality. But it's hard to tell a country that, you don't need this. Israel, for instance, Israel has nuclear weapons.
Right. But they have this policy of deliberate ambiguity around it, right?
Yeah. It's become farcical at this point. But they don't fully admit it. But everyone knows they have nuclear weapons. And, do I think it's good that Israel has nuclear weapons? I think it's terrible. I think that they have this thing called the Samson Doctrine, which if they ever feel that their territorial integrity was mortally threatened, they would fire nuclear weapons at the capital cities of all the surrounding countries. It's a very extreme and horrifying scenario. But, from their strategic perspective, it kind of makes sense in a way, because who's going to guarantee their security? I think the U.S. probably would guarantee their security, but who knows in the long term? They are the ultimate guarantors of the security now. As a small country who all your neighbors don't like you, that is the only real guarantee. So again, setting aside the morality of it, I don't like the morality of it, but I do think that, the Ukrainian leaders now, they're talking about what they did in the 90s, and they're openly kicking themselves. They're saying this is a huge mistake. We got completely screwed over by the world. We were a small country. We believed in all these rules that other big countries would protect us from aggression. And guess what? They actually didn't. And why do we even expect differently? We should have kept those nukes. If we had, maybe we wouldn't be seeing thousands of our citizens dying every week.
It is stunning. It is chilling, right? To have to engage with these things, but it doesn't benefit anyone for us not to actually, I think, confront the reality. And basically, there's discrepancies, for example, around Taiwan. Like Taiwan is seen as a key kind of fulcrum of global power. The United States would step in to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression. The other option would be for Taiwan to sort of arm itself with nukes to prevent that sort of aggression. but there is no scenario in which it can be sort of apathetic about its security. And that is, another thing that the Ukraine crisis is bringing to the fore is the fact that now, there is a massive increase in military spending as a result. Europe has gone, Germany especially has gone, down and down in terms of its military spending. It's constantly been, reducing its military spending, but now that is trending in the opposite direction. And the other thing I guess I wanted to ask you about is this question of sanctions. So unlike Taiwan, Ukraine is sort of on its own. And the way that the United States is trying to target Russia is through a kind of economic warfare. And you've written about how you've written this article basically subtitled, a warning about civilian harm of sanctions that notes, the Russian people didn't elect to go to war. And that, as you put it, what is not happening is a targeting of the Russian high tech and defense sectors, but a targeting of the entire Russian economy. Like you're basically advocating in this article that sanctions be targeted and proportional and reversible. Like you're talking about sanction reform. And similarly, Tony Wood in his book, Russia Without Putin, talks about how, generally speaking, sanctions targeting, an entire country's economy confuse, as he puts it, a symptom for a prime cause. So I wondered if you could speak to your, in some ways, moral objection to sanctions, but then also the ways in which you're objecting to even the efficacy of sanctions. I mean, you're saying there are these long-term economic effects, but it's also the case that they're just factually ineffective, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What is the goal theoretically of sanctions when they're imposed? The goal is to change the behavior of a government that's being sanctioned. Mm-hmm. Do we have a lot of evidence of cases where that's been the case? It's actually happened. It's actually worked that a government which has been sanctioned has stopped doing the thing that we don't want them to. I don't see a ton of examples. Maybe Libya was one partial example before the Libyan government was deposed not that long after, which kind of undercut it a bit. There are not tons of examples of a country being placed under extreme sanctions that changes behavior. We have far more examples of countries which were sanctioned, where the people suffered a lot, where there was huge humanitarian crises as a result of sanctions, and where nothing after that, all that changed that much. So, there's a big disjuncture. I think that the problem is that, it's very easy to put sanctions. It's not easy to send troops somewhere. So if you have a call to do something in response to some country which is doing something the U.S. doesn't like, there's a strong call for something to be done in response to that, then it's very politically easy to slap sanctions on them. That's the easiest thing to do. You can sanction them. Sending, troops is harder because, people may die, and then the American people will have some more insight into that. They'll know about it. They don't even know about sanctions, really. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit different. It's very easy to do sanctions, politically easy, and it's become so easy that it's done without even thinking, so to speak. You could say it's done without even the slightest concern about the effect of it. You don't even have to be successful in the sanctions. You don't have to be successful in the sanctions at all. You can be unsuccessful, and it doesn't really matter. No one's holding you to account. So I think it's just become very easy. And then, because the deaths from sanctions are indirect, who's going to notice if people are starving to death in a country which people can't find on the map, or who's going to notice if people in a country who used to be middle class are now very, very poor. It's not going to come to people's attention that much as it would if there were killings taking place at the hands of U.S. troops, for instance. Mm-hmm. So effectively, I think that's the main reason. They're overused, and if you look at the record, these overuse of, despite being non-violent, quote unquote, these sanctions do kill a lot of innocent people, and they're very indiscriminate. And look, there's this war in Ukraine happening right now. My personal opinion is that it is very wrong, and the Ukrainian government and people should be supported in defending themselves against clearly it's aggression and invasion by another country, probably the most naked form of aggression you can get. I don't think it'll be an effective response, really. It's a non sequitur to just turn around and make shit so the Russians can't, withdraw from their bank accounts, in X amount of time. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very easy to do. I think what would make more sense is to do something which changes the order of battle, or changes the circumstances on the battlefield in Ukraine, which the Biden administration is doing, which is arming the Ukrainian army. I think that's much more preferable. I'm not in favor of arming irregular militias like Azov Battalion or what have you. I think that's very dangerous to start arming not irregulars. But as long as it's a legitimate central government, which has legitimacy in Ukraine, then arming it is not an insane response to a situation when the war has already begun. They're not beginning the war.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard to argue against. I've heard, people try to make coach an argument against arming Ukraine. The fact that it's not going through the proper channels, that you kind of gestured to that, like it may be going into the wrong hands. But it's hard to, and also the fact that you've got this, a boon for the defense industry, Raytheon and these companies are talking openly about how it's a windfall for them and so on. But at the same time, if there is this naked aggression, how do you repel it? It's just a blunt fact. I guess the thing that I feel like I should ask you about is the question of to what extent there is this kind of hypocrisy with regard to kind of the grievability almost of lives, as some theorists have put it, right? So, you talked about the cost of sanctions in countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and Yemen, where you've got economies collapsing and huge numbers of people starving. And the fact that sanctions are far away and calculated through this kind of like demographic research rather than through the kind of war of images, as it were. Yeah. And so there maybe is not enough pressure because of that for the U.S. to reform its sanctions regime. And part of that uphill battle for many people in African countries and in South America is actually trying to make visible the extent to which a certain kind of ethno-nationalism or racism is at the heart of the United States backing Ukraine in the way that it is, right? So the fact that racism, there's been racism against African refugees trying to escape Ukraine. There's been a real disregard for Palestinian life, for, the people of Yemen. The United States is not, for example, rejecting energy from or oil from Saudi Arabia, but it is, sanctioning Russia and so on. Could you we've made a habit in this conversation of dealing with particularly problematic and tricky issues. This to me is the hardest one in some ways to negotiate. This question of how the world is still stratified in terms of geopolitics by questions of racial belonging. How do you see that kind of playing out in this war going forward, and how is this war kind of exposed that for the rest of the world?
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. It's an excellent question. And it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit since it started. There's absolutely a double standard. Not double standard is probably understating it. There's a grievous disparity between what lives are considered grievable or not. And it's clearly there's a racial and cultural tracking towards it as well too. If I were to steelman the argument, I would say that, of course, Westerners care about the lives of other Westerners or people who they perceive as Westerners more because there's cultural affinity and historic affinity and there's proximity and so forth. And if you look at the Middle East or Africa, Middle Easterners and Africans, they also care about people in proximate countries more than they do about distant people. I think there's some truth to that, but there's this, there's like this hypocrisy where when it's convenient, you could say the U.S. elites will say that, we speak for all humanity when we speak. They take that position when it's convenient. And when it's not convenient, then they pivot and say that, well, obviously we care about our own people more than other people. And, it's very like slippery sort of reasoning. I think that we have to step back and we have to just look at what are our principles. What are our principles here, independent of what the U.S. or the U.S. elites think or do in their own circumstances. They do something which are right, something which are wrong. We'll leave it at that. That's their own problem. They have to figure that out. What do we believe? We believe that, okay, we have a principle that a country should not be menaced by another country. That's the case if you're talking about two African countries in conflict with each other. It's the case we're talking about two European countries in conflict. It's the case we're talking about two Middle Eastern countries in conflict, or Latin American countries. A large country should not invade another country. You should not settle its differences with another country by force. That's something which we think is wrong. And okay, if that's wrong, then we have a principle that guides us. And if they're inconsistent in applying it, and if they are, racistly dismissive of things happening in other parts of the world, then that's their problem. They're wrong for that, and we'll tell them they're wrong for that. But we're not going to be wrong because they're wrong. That's kind of the way I think about it. And also, I think that I just cannot take it seriously, the fact that the U.S., after all these years of being the bad guy, 20 years of being the bad guy in the eyes of most of the world, beating up all these small countries, killing all these people very wantonly, without any accountability or regard, still waging economic warfare against innocent people in Afghanistan, Iran, many other places. They're not the idea that they are portraying themselves as the good guys now because they happen to be on the right side of the conflict in the eyes of a lot of people, then that's just laughable. It's a laughable perspective. No one in the global south can see the U.S. as a benevolent actor in the world after what we've seen for many, many years, even predating the war on terror. They may be a benevolent actor in Europe, you could argue, but that's for Europeans' perspective. It's not. No one else takes that seriously. No one can take it seriously.
Right.
So we should dismiss that. But let's dismiss that and let's put them aside and let's focus on what we think is moral. And I think that in this case, that would be to show solidarity, or even to say that if you want to take arms from the U.S. to defend yourself against Russia, people of Ukraine, it's a completely understandable decision, and I'm not going to stand in the way of that. I think that makes sense given your circumstances. And we'll monitor, and we'll also highlight the racism and the double standards that are apparent and which you just discussed in your own comments, Scott. So
no, yeah, it's helpful. It kind of it connects back to what you were saying around having some moral baseline is better than nothing. And I think so much of the problem seems to be when you align with a certain narrative of national belonging, it becomes really untenable to maintain any moral baseline, right? Because suddenly you have to buy into everything that a nation symbolically stands for, and nations themselves, as Zygmunt Bauman put it, are kind of a community of accomplices. They're almost always wrought through violence, and so having a moral baseline as a community, as a culture, as a people, as a person, maybe is more tenable than trying to align with something as big, amorphous, and amoral as a nation. I don't know. But anyway, thanks so much for making the time. It was really great talking to you.
It was my pleasure. Really great questions and really fun discussion.